Most of us are taught from a very early age that kindness is a virtue. We grow up believing that if we show compassion, patience, and understanding, especially toward those who are difficult or hurting, we're somehow making the world a better place. And in many cases, that's true. Kindness has an extraordinary capacity to heal, to unify, to strengthen bonds. But what most people don't realize, and what no one really wants to admit, is that kindness in the wrong context becomes not only ineffective, but actually dangerous. This is especially true when you're dealing with narcissists, because what narcissists perceive isn't your goodwill or your humanity. They perceive an opportunity. To a narcissist, kindness is not a gesture of strength or maturity. It's a vulnerability. It's a lever they can pull, a tool they can use. In fact, the more generous, empathetic, and forgiving you are, the more a narcissist will take that as confirmation that you're someone they can manipulate. They don't respond to compassion the way you might expect or hope. They respond to it the way a predator responds to an open gate. Now, I'm not saying this to turn you into someone who is cold or cynical, but you do need to see the psychological dynamic at play clearly and without delusion. Narcissism is not merely arrogance. It's not just selfishness or vanity. At its core, narcissism is a pathological need to be in control, especially over the emotional reality of other people. And kindness, if not matched with discernment and boundaries, opens the door wide for that control to take root. The trap here is subtle. You think you're helping. You tell yourself they're just wounded, that if you're patient enough, loving enough, gentle enough, they'll come around. That's a beautiful thought, but it's built on an illusion. Narcissists don't want to be healed. They don't want to see your side. They want to keep the power dynamic intact. And your kindness plays directly into that goal. This is where people get caught in the cycle, especially those who are naturally empathetic or who come from families where they were taught to overfunction emotionally. The narcissist wounds you subtly or directly. You respond with grace. You avoid confrontation. You give them the benefit of the doubt. And what do? They escalate. They test your limits further. And each time you meet that escalation with more kindness, you teach them that there are no limits. And they learn very quickly. The narcissist isn't confused. They're not unaware of how their behavior affects you. On the contrary, they're often highly attuned to it. They know how to use guilt, silence, and charm to manipulate your emotional state. They push just far enough to stay out of obvious danger, then retreat when it suits them, only to strike again when you're vulnerable. And they count on your kindness to cushion every blow. This is psychological warfare masquerading as a relationship. The hardest part is coming to terms with the fact that your positive traits, your compassion, your patience, your forgiveness are being used against you. That realization is painful, but it's also liberating. Because once you see that, you stop blaming yourself. You stop thinking, if I were just nicer, maybe they'd change. No, that's not how this works. Kindness to a narcissist doesn't rehabilitate them. It feels them. It's a bitter truth, but an essential one. Not everyone is deserving of your kindness. That's not to say you withhold it from the world, but you must be surgical about where you place it. Narcissists don't need your kindness. They need consequences. And more importantly, you need clarity. You need to understand that extending compassion to someone who habitually abuses it is not just unwise, It's an act of self-betrayal. When your kindness becomes currency in someone else's power game, you are no longer participating in a relationship. You are trapped in a psychological performance, one in which your role is to constantly forgive, constantly appease, and constantly absorb the cost of their dysfunction. That is not kindness. That is enabling. If you take only one thing away from this, let it be this. Kindness must be reserved for the willing. It must be paired with wisdom, or it becomes complicity. You are not morally obligated to be generous to someone who weaponizes your generosity. There is nothing noble about allowing yourself to be used. True kindness includes the courage to say, "This is not acceptable. I will not participate in this any longer." Because ultimately, your kindness has value, but only when it's given freely, not extracted under duress, not manipulated through guilt, and certainly not handed over to someone who has proven time and again that they will use it to destroy you. If kindness is a virtue, then discernment is its protector. Without it, even your best intentions can become a trap. One of the most common mistakes people make when dealing with narcissists is assuming that deep down, the narcissist wants the same thing we all want: peace, harmony, mutual respect. And that assumption is not just wrong, it's dangerous. Because when you believe that, you're constantly confused by their behavior. You find yourself asking, why are they provoking conflict when things were finally calm? Why stir the pot when everything seemed to be going well? The answer is difficult to accept, but essential to understand. Narcissists don't want peace, they want control. And one of the most effective ways to maintain control, especially over emotionally intelligent, empathetic people, is to chaos. Peace to a narcissist is not a goal, it's a threat. Because in peace, people reflect, they regain clarity, they start to ask questions, they remember who they are. And that's dangerous for someone whose entire game relies on distorting your perception of them, of yourself, of reality itself. Narcissists thrive in instability. They keep the emotional environment in constant flux because when you're unbalanced, when you're always walking on eggshells, second-guessing yourself, bracing for the next storm, you become easier to influence. You become less likely to assert yourself. And most importantly, you become more dependent on them for cues about what's true, what's normal, what's acceptable. In that sense, chaos isn't accidental. It's engineered. It's part of a psychological strategy that narcissists employ, consciously or unconsciously, to dominate their environment. This is why the narcissist often picks fights out of nowhere, why they create confusion when things feel stable, why they accuse you of things they're actually doing. It's not irrational. It's not them being moody or difficult. It's about keeping you off balance, emotionally disoriented enough that they can reassert themselves as the central figure in your psychological world. And once they're in that position, once they become the lens through which you evaluate reality, they've won. Because then every conversation, every conflict, every moment of doubt becomes an opportunity to reinforce their dominance. They tell you how you feel. They tell you what really happened. They tell you who you are. Now you might ask, why would anyone want that level of control? And here's where it gets dark. At the core of narcissism is a fractured sense of self, a fragile, inflated identity built on illusion rather than authenticity. Because the narcissist doesn't know how to regulate their own self-worth internally, they need constant external validation. And if they can't get admiration, they'll settle for fear. If they can't inspire love, they'll provoke chaos. Either way, they remain at the center of your emotional universe. It's like a child throwing a tantrum, not because they're truly angry, but because it guarantees attention. A narcissist has never grown out of that pattern. They just got more sophisticated at hiding it behind charm, manipulation, and manufactured crisis. There's a common misconception that empathy is always good, that it's universally healing, universally helpful, and always the moral high ground. And while empathy is, without question, one of the most powerful and beautiful aspects of being human, we need to be honest about something. Empathy without boundaries becomes a liability, especially in the hands of someone who knows exactly how to use it against you. Now, here is this more true than in a relationship with a narcissist. See, the narcissist doesn't respond to your empathy the way a healthy person does. They don't see it as a bridge toward mutual understanding. They don't feel gratitude or respect or a desire to meet you halfway. What they see is leverage. They see access. And they begin to study you, not because they're curious about your inner world, but because they're looking for entry points, psychological opening, emotional vulnerabilities. Empathy in this context becomes a roadmap. You're showing them where your values lie, where your sense of responsibility kicks in, where you feel guilt, where you feel shame, where you're most likely to bend. And once they've mapped that terrain, they start to work it quietly, consistently, sometimes even kindly at first. They learn what stories move you, what apologies you'll accept, what excuses you'll absorb. And they use those to justify behavior that in any other context you'd never tolerate, because you're not just empathizing with what they've done, you're empathizing with why they did it. And in doing so, you unconsciously start rewriting the moral logic of the relationship. That's the most dangerous part. And the narcissist, of course, loves this. It allows them to continue their behavior unchecked. They know that all they have to do is tell you the right sob story or turn on the waterworks at the right time, and you'll recalibrate your entire moral compass to accommodate them. They don't need to be accountable. They just need to be understood. And you, being empathic, take the bait because you mistake understanding for healing and you mistake pain for goodness. What you have to realize is that your empathy is not free. It's a finite emotional resource. And when you give it to someone who's exploiting it, it doesn't just hurt you. It hurts everyone else who could have benefited from that same empathy. Your children, your friends, your own nervous system. You're bleeding out for someone who's not even trying to stop the wound. Oh, what do? You stop offering empathy where there is no recipe. You stop confusing emotional chaos with emotional depth. But when it becomes a weapon in someone else's hands, the kindest thing you can do is take it back. One of the most difficult truths people have to confront when dealing with a narcissist is this: the very thing you believe is helping may actually be hurting you. Not just emotionally, but existentially. At the level of your identity, your sense of meaning, your perception of right and wrong. And this is where kindness, which we're often taught is the highest virtue, can become one of the most dangerous things to offer. Not because kindness is inherently bad, it's not, but because in the wrong environment, in the presence of someone who lacks both conscience and self-awareness, kindness can become the glue that keeps the entire dysfunctional system intact. Let me explain. When you show kindness to someone who respects boundaries, who acknowledges wrongdoing, who is capable of remorse, kindness becomes transformative. It becomes a catalyst for growth, for healing, for connection. But when that same kindness is extended to a narcissist, someone who sees your forgiveness as weakness, your patience as permission, and your empathy as leverage, it becomes a reinforcer of abuse. This is not a theory. It's a psychological mechanism. You see, human behavior, especially in close relationships, operates on a system of reinforcement. What gets rewarded gets repeated. When a narcissist lashes out, gaslights you, disrespects your time, your energy, your emotional reality, and you respond by being the bigger person, by smoothing things over, by absorbing the chaos, they learn something. They learn that there are no real consequences, that they can violate your dignity and still retain access to your life. They test you, and you pass the test, not by standing firm, but by accommodating them. And so the abuse doesn't just continue, it escalates. It becomes a performance. And like all performances, it needs an audience. Your kindness keeps the stage lights on. This is where people begin to lose themselves, not all at once, but gradually. You start compromising on small things, your preferences, your voice in a conversation, your need for space. Then it moves to bigger things, your core values, your boundaries, your peace of mind. And before long, you've reshaped your entire personality just to keep the narcissist from erupting or withdrawing or launching another psychological ambush. You tell yourself you're doing it out of love, that you're helping them grow, that they'll see your loyalty and change. But what you're really doing is teaching them that your self-worth is negotiable. And the more you teach them that, the more they will demand. Here's the hard part. Narcissists don't stop because they're satisfied. They stop when they're stopped. You can't outlove a narcissist's pathology. You can't out-nurture it. It doesn't respond to care. It responds to consequence. And yet this is the dilemma so many people face. They built their identity around being kind, around being compassionate, understanding, patient. So the idea of withdrawing kindness, of enforcing hard boundaries, feels like a betrayal of the self. It feels cruel. But here's the deeper truth. Enabling abuse is not kindness, it's complicity. And self-betrayal, even when it's done in the name of love, is still betrayal. There's a point where kindness becomes self-sacrifice. And if you're not careful, you start confusing your willingness to endure suffering with strength. But real strength isn't the ability to withstand abuse, it's the ability to recognize it and walk away. When you find yourself entangled with a narcissist, whether in a romantic relationship, a family dynamic, or a professional context, there's one reality that begins to surface with haunting clarity. Your boundaries are the first casualties. And not just in the obvious sense, not just in the big dramatic blowouts or the blatant violations. No, the most dangerous erosion happens slowly, subtly, through a series of compromises that don't feel like compromises at all, at least not at first. You silence yourself to keep the peace. You let a hurtful comment slide because you don't want to make it worse. You dismiss the pit in your stomach with phrases like, maybe I'm overreacting, or they're just under a lot of stress. And little by little, you begin to disappear from your own life. And here's the thing most people don't realize until it's far too late. The moment you start withholding your boundaries, you are not just betraying your instincts, you are betraying your integrity. You are telling yourself quietly but repeatedly, my comfort, my clarity, my emotional safety, they're negotiable, they're secondary. They don't matter as much as keeping this person calm or close or pleased. That is not compassion. That is not love. That is self-abandonment. And narcissists feed on it. They are drawn, not to your strength, though they may admire it at first, but to your willingness to suppress that strength, to edit yourself, to diminish your needs. They see boundaries not as mutual agreements, but as obstacles. And so they test them, not always overtly, but consistently. They press against the edges of your tolerance, watching to see if you'll stand your ground. And when you don't, when you flinch, when you bend, when you explain instead of assert, they learn something important about you. They learn that your love comes at the expense of your truth, and that makes you manageable. But here's the deeper philosophical issue. The abandonment of boundaries isn't just a relational problem. It's an existential one. Because to set a boundary is to declare, I am here, I am real. I have limits and needs and rights. And when you relinquish those limits in the name of harmony or pity or fear, what you're really relinquishing is your own being. You are negotiating with your own soul. This is why after months or years of this dynamic, people often say things like, I don't even recognize myself anymore. Because on some level, they're right. You've become someone who prioritizes another person's narrative over your own experience. You've outsourced your moral authority to someone whose only real commitment is to themselves. And it's not that you didn't try. You tried everything. Kindness, patience, empathy, silence. You convinced yourself that if you were just more understanding, more forgiving, more accommodating, things would finally improve. But they didn't, because you were solving the wrong problem. The problem was never that you didn't give enough. The problem was that you never demanded enough in return. And demanding is not aggression. It's self-respect. It's saying, I will not participate in a relationship that requires me to diminish my dignity. It's recognizing that peace built on silence is not peace. It's a hostage situation. Of course, the fear that holds people back from setting boundaries is almost always the same. What if I lose them? And that's a valid fear. Because yes, sometimes setting a boundary will cost you the relationship. But here's the painful paradox. If your relationship depends on you not having boundaries, then what you have isn't a relationship. It's an arrangement, a performance, a survival strategy. And survival is not the same as living. Boundaries are not wall. They're not punishments. They're declarations of value. Statements that say, I take myself seriously, I honor my inner world, and I will not betray it just to maintain someone else's illusion of control. And if someone finds that threatening, it's because they were benefiting from your self-erasure. So the question becomes not, can I set a boundary, but can I afford not to? The truth is, withholding boundaries is not neutral, it's not harmless. It's an ongoing act of betrayal against the part of you that knows better. The part of you that remembers what it feels like to speak freely, to walk through the world with dignity, to trust your own perception of reality. When people talk about toxic relationships, especially those involving narcissists, the conversation inevitably circles back to one question. What can I do to fix this? And usually what they really mean is, how much more can I give? How much more patience? How much more compassion? How much more sacrifice will finally earn me the peace I've been chasing? But here's the hard truth, one most people don't want to hear. There is no version of this story where giving more of yourself to someone who refuses to change leads to healing. You can't resolve dysfunction by doubling down on niceness. You can't repair manipulation with more understanding. And you cannot rescue a narcissist by slowly destroying yourself. Because the antidote to narcissistic abuse is not kindness, it's not empathy, It's not turning the other cheek for the 100th time. The antidote is self-respect. Fierce, unwavering, unapologetic self-respect. And that's not just a nice idea, it's a psychological necessity. Let's break this down. Self-respect is the internal recognition of your own value, independent of anyone else's approval. It's the anchor that keeps you from drifting into self-doubt every time someone attacks your reality. It's what allows you to say no and mean it, to say that's not acceptable, without needing to justify it endlessly. It's what lets you walk away not because you stopped caring, but because you finally started caring about yourself. And this is where people get it wrong. They confuse self-respect with arrogance or with cruelty. They think if I start asserting myself, if I stop being endlessly nice, I'll become just like them. But that's not what self-respect is. Self-respect is not about dominance. It's about dignity. It's about drawing a line, not to punish the other person, but to protect your sanity. The narcissist doesn't fear confrontation. They don't fear your tears. What they fear, what they can't manipulate, is someone who respects themselves too much to stay in the game. Someone who sees through the performance and refuses to applaud. That's power. Not power over others, but power with yourself. Because here's what happens when you start leading with self-respect instead of niceness. The entire dynamic shifts. You stop being the emotional caregiver to someone who never reciprocates. You stop waiting for validation from a person whose identity is built on denial. You stop trying to prove your worth to someone who benefits from you doubting it. And when you stop doing those things, you free up an immense amount of energy. Energy you can now direct towards something constructive, healing, rebuilding, growing. You start to see the manipulation for what it is, not a reflection of your inadequacy, but a desperate attempt to control something they don't understand. Accountability. But self-respect requires a kind of internal revolution. It requires you to reframe your beliefs, not just about the narcissist, but about yourself. You have to stop seeing yourself as the fixer, the savior, the one who must hold everything together. You are not the glue for someone else's broken pieces. You are not a rehabilitation center for adult children in adult bodies. You are a human being